This is Lesson 29.3, The Decline of Developed Socialism. What led to the decline of Soviet power in the East Bloc? Well, we've got College Board Topic 9.1, Contextualizing Cold War and Contemporary Europe, of course. Explain the context in which the Cold War developed, spread, and ended in Europe. Demographic changes, economic growth, total war, disruptions of traditional social patterns, and competing definitions of freedom and justice altered the experiences of everyday life. New voices gained prominence in political, intellectual, and social discourse. We'll certainly see that. College Board Topic 9.3, The Cold War. Explain the causes, events, and effects of the Cold War in the period following World War II. The Cold War played out on a global stage and involved propaganda campaigns, covert actions, limited hot wars in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and an arms race with the threat of nuclear war. And I guess we'll see a little bit of that. College Board Topic 9.4, Two superpowers emerge. Explain the economic and political consequences of the Cold War for Europe. Central and Eastern European nations within the Soviet bloc followed an economic model based on central planning, extensive social welfare, and specialized production among bloc members. This brought with it the restriction of individual rights and freedoms, suppression of dissent, and constraint of emigration for the various populations within the Soviet bloc. Eastern European nations were bound by their relationships with the Soviet Union, which oscillated between repression and limited reform until the collapse of communist governments in Eastern Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union. After 1956, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policies failed to meet their economic goals within the Soviet Union. Combined with reactions to existing limitations on individual rights, this prompted revolts in Eastern Europe, which ended with a reimposition of Soviet rule and repressive totalitarian regimes. And we have College Board Topic 9.7, The Fall of Communism. Explain the causes and effects of the end of the Cold War. Following a long period of economic stagnation, Mikhail Gorbachev's internal reforms of perestroika and glasnost, designed to make the Soviet system more flexible, failed to stave off the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of its hegemonic control over Eastern and Central European satellites. And we have College Board Topic 9.14, 20th and 21st Century Culture, Arts, and Demographic Trends. Explain how and why European culture changed from the period following World War II to the present. Organized religion continued to play a role in European social and cultural life despite the challenges of military and ideological conflict, modern secularism, and rapid social changes. We'll certainly see that. The challenges of totalitarianism and communism in Central and Eastern Europe brought mixed responses from the Christian churches. The place? Eastern Europe. Time frame? About 1970 to about 1990. Key concepts of the decline of developed socialism: perestroika, glasnost, Charter 77, solidarity, now, and the Gdansk Agreement. Key people of the decline of Soviet socialism: Mikhail Gorbachev, Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, Pope John Paul II, and Ronald Reagan. Intro. In the last lesson, 29.2, we saw the way that post-war economic challenges of the 1970s caused crisis and conflict for the Western consensus to deal with. But what about the Soviet Union and the East Bloc? The promised Marxist utopia, the workers' paradise, still had not arrived by the 1970s, and communist leaders were having to adjust their message accordingly. So what was this updated communist narrative? The society of perfect equality and perfect abundance was still on the way, just in the future. But for now, people were going to have to accept the system as it was in this transitional state. The system of the East was still going to have to prove itself superior to that of the West. Much had already been accomplished on the road to utopia, and the name for all that had been accomplished so far was developed socialism. This narrative was going up against serious challenges, though. Life in the East was harsh. There were limits on personal and political freedom. There were growing reform movements. The Cold War was heating up as the United States turned further to the right under Ronald Reagan's leadership. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, and he opened an era of sweeping reforms. He transformed Soviet culture and politics. He reduced Cold War tensions. However, Gorbachev could not deliver a turnaround for the economic stagnation in the Soviet Union. State and society in the East Bloc. Actually, communist leaders in the East Bloc had accomplished a lot by the 1970s. Agriculture had been collectivized, except in Poland. Business and industry had been nationalized. Class differences, the gap between the rich and the poor, had been leveled quite a bit, though Communist Party members still got more goods, privileges, and benefits than everyone else. Welfare and benefits were extensive. Free health care, guaranteed employment, public transportation, subsidies for food and housing. But developed socialism had a lackluster performance in many other areas of life in the East Bloc. The Communist Party dominated life. There were constant celebratory events and organizations, rallies, festivals, new holidays, and all were meant to drive home the idea that the socialist state was the best way to live. But many people in the East Bloc were apathetic and disengaged from participating in all of the state-sponsored activities. Many conformed just enough to avoid negative attention. Living standards in the East Bloc were low. They beat the way things were in the developing world, but they were significantly below living standards in the West. There were shortages, quality issues, and lack of choice regarding many basic goods. Central planning often got blamed for a lot of these deficiencies. Informal networks of family and friends often got people the things they needed most. Equality for women was insufficient under developed socialism. Official policy was that women should be treated absolutely equal. Women even got free child care so that they could have careers. But it's still difficult to juggle home responsibilities with work responsibilities, whether you live in the East or the West. Women still often faced unequal and sexist working conditions. And it was very difficult to form any kind of advocacy group for any cause in the East Bloc. And for this reason, feminist groups had trouble getting off the ground and lobbying for reform. Developed socialism could not deal with the energy crisis and stagflation of the 1970s that we talked about back in Lesson 29.2. For a while, the Soviet Union was able to prop up the East Bloc economically with its large reserves of cheap oil and gas. But this support collapsed in the 1980s. East Bloc leaders were often not willing to make certain compromises that would have improved the effectiveness of developed socialism. For example, making the transition from an industrial to a post-industrial economy that the West was engaged in from Lesson 29.2 was out of the question. This move was hurting industrial workers in the West, after all. And in the East, communist leaders claimed to be in full support of the industrial working class. Miners, shipbuilders, construction workers, factory workers. This was at the very heart of what communism was all about. What would communism be if it was not looking out for the workers? Communist leaders also couldn't make austerity cuts to the social welfare system. Communism sold itself on the idea that the state cares about you and will take care of you. Also, the East Bloc couldn't stop paying expensive subsidies to prop up its heavy industries, steel, mining, etc. High-tech industries in the East were hampered by embargoes of technology from the West, and therefore East Bloc manufactured goods were becoming increasingly uncompetitive on the world market. To meet expenses, East Bloc countries were even borrowing from Western banks and governments. And this expanding cycle of debt would eventually lead to total economic collapse by the end of the 1980s. Ironically, one-party communist rule actually caused more inequality than it fixed. The best careers and educations were reserved for party members. Educations and jobs were often used as rewards for political favors. And as a result, talented, hardworking people were left with little reward for their efforts. One-party communist rule was also repressive. There were travel restrictions, reform movements were quashed, economic liberalization was opposed, dissidents were jailed or exiled. Dissent in Czechoslovakia and Poland. If you can't go through the mountain, maybe you can go around the mountain. If communist leaders would not reform and liberalize in the face of economic stagnation, perhaps there was another way. Directly challenging communist leaders got you violence and Soviet invasions. Reforming the Communist Party from within just got you the same thing as had been demonstrated in Prague in 1968, as we learned in Lesson 29.1. But perhaps it would be possible to form a civil society informally, outside of and apart from the official communist apparatus. Czechoslovakia in 1977. Charter 77. A small informal group of citizens wrote an unofficial manifesto, and it was called Charter 77. And this group included playwright and future Czech president Václav Havel. Charter 77 started criticizing Czechoslovakia's communist government for things like ignoring human rights that are specified in the Helsinki Accords, or not protecting the environment, or ignoring civil and political rights, or censorship. Of course, the group who published Charter 77 was targeted for immediate repression by the communist government. But the group, through the publication of Charter 77, gave the common people a voice, which the Czech communist government had to hear. It managed to express the people's unhappiness with developed socialism, and it challenged ordinary Czech citizens not to just passively accept communist authority. The movement that created Charter 77 was a grassroots movement. It came from a place where the formal government had less direct control. Ordinary people who did not work for the government. Poland and solidarity. What informal means does a worker have to resist communism? Well, he or she can use the greatest weapon that he or she has, work. Workers can get together, go on strike, and refuse to work. Poland was not exactly like the other East Bloc Soviet satellite countries. Most Poles remained devoutly Catholic. While agricultural collectivization had been nearly completed in the rest of the East, it had barely started in Poland. Most of the Polish agriculture remained in private hands, and Poland's working class was notoriously unruly. In the 1970s, Poland's communist leaders took a huge gamble on an economic miracle. Economic stagnation since the 1960s had caused a lot of protest among Poland's working class. The Polish government secured huge amounts of loans and technology from the West, and the hope was that Poland could pull off a great economic leap forward. Instead, it was a complete disaster. The energy crisis of 1973 torpedoed the entire effort, and now the church, intellectuals, and workers were all angry. In 1978, Poland's communist leaders got another huge inconvenience that they could do very little about. The Archbishop of Krakow, Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, became John Paul II, Pope of the entire Catholic Church. A Polish guy was the Pope. The Polish people were ecstatic. In June 1979, Pope John Paul II did a tour of Poland. He spoke to huge crowds of devoted Poles, and he preached to them about the love of Christ and country, and he spoke of the inalienable rights of man. And Poland's communist government had very little control over the Pope or anything he said. Again, he was someone who operated completely outside of their authority. Strikes in August of 1980. In 1980, 16,000 shipyard workers in the port city of Gdansk went on strike and occupied the shipyards for 18 days. Their leader was an electrician named Lech Walesa, and he was a devout Catholic and a huge fan of the Pope. The strikers had a revolutionary set of demands upon the Polish communist government: a civil society, the right to form trade unions free of government control, ironic in a system that supposedly rules on behalf of the worker, freedom of speech, release of political prisoners, and economic reforms. Solidarity. After 18 days, the Polish government gave in to the demands of the shipyard workers and signed the Gdansk Agreement. The workers of Poland now had the right to form an independent trade union to protect their rights from the government. And they got to work right away forming a union called Solidarity. As a nationwide union, it had 40,000 full-time employees and 9.5 million members. Solidarity's strength and moderation. For years, Solidarity's main focus was not much more than to enforce the concessions they got in the Gdansk Agreement. Solidarity did not see its role as challenging the communist government's political power. But even then, they had a lot of leverage over the government. They could call a nationwide strike anytime they wanted to. And this strength kept the communist leaders coming to the table. In March 1981, Solidarity came close to calling a nationwide strike. Solidarity called it off after winning only minor concessions from the Polish government, and this sparked a lot of dissatisfaction within the union. Many thought that Lech Walesa needed to be tougher and not so moderate. Solidarity started to weaken from within due to competing factions. And as we have seen, going all the way back to Lesson 21.5, Revolutions of 1848, conservative forces will take advantage of any divisions within the opposition that they can in order to rebound and reassert their power. Solidarity outlawed. Poland's military government, which had been forced to deal with Solidarity for years, saw its opportunity to go on the offensive. They accused Solidarity of promoting economic collapse with their demands, and they accused Solidarity of provoking a possible Soviet invasion, such as were seen in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. In December 1981, General Wojciech Jaruzelski, military leader of Poland's communist government, proclaimed martial law. He outlawed Solidarity, and he arrested its leaders. Fake it till you make it. For years, Solidarity remained active underground. The Polish government would not or could not use terror to crush Solidarity completely. And millions of Poles started deliberately acting as if they were free, acting as if they already had political and religious liberty, acting as if they had cultural and artistic freedom, acting as if they had trade union rights, and acting as if they had the rights to display patriotic nationalism. If the government can't or won't stop you from acting as if you were free, then you really are free. The Polish economy continued to deteriorate, even with Solidarity outlawed. And this clearly meant that Solidarity's demands had not been the cause of Poland's economic woes. Solidarity was even getting the attention of the Soviet Union as a source of fresh thinking. Solidarity's ability to thrive in the midst of being outlawed would facilitate Solidarity's rise as a true political power. From détente back to Cold War. Détente basically collapsed by the end of the 1970s due to critical geopolitical missteps that made the Soviet Union look untrustworthy. Under Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union basically ignored the human rights part of the Helsinki Accords. And the Soviet Union was still building up its military. And they were also stirring up communist revolutions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. They wanted to save an unwanted Marxist government in Afghanistan. And Westerners feared that the Soviet Union could force its way into the oil-rich Middle East. NATO's lack of conviction. NATO had also failed to act decisively in support of Solidarity when it emerged in Poland. Perhaps NATO would soon be just as ineffective when dealing with the Soviet bloc. NATO did manage to survive and thrive under Ronald Reagan. Carter had actually begun a strong U.S. military buildup while he was still president. Ronald Reagan expanded and accelerated the buildup that Carter had begun. Reagan labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire. He deployed short-range nuclear missiles in Western Europe. He built up the U.S. Navy. And he successfully enlisted Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Great Britain and Chancellor Helmut Kohl of West Germany to act as powerful partners in his opposition to the Soviet bloc. Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union. Under Leonid Brezhnev and his predecessors, the Soviet Union had become a well-oiled political machine. There was a comprehensive, centrally planned, top-down system. 17.5 million Communist Party members maintained tight control over the country. And ordinary people knew to leave politics to the higher-ups. But this advanced system also facilitated economic stagnation. Personal ambition and hard work went unrewarded. There was a general sense of apathy among the people. So bureaucratic incompetence and alcoholism were rampant. When Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet premier in 1985, he was willing to look at the situation with fresh eyes. Gorbachev was willing to do whatever was necessary to turn the Soviet Union's economic situation around. And the first thing that Gorbachev could see was that the Soviet Union's status as a superpower was slipping. He could see that the arms race was killing the Soviet Union's economy. Therefore, better relations with the West would be essential. Gorbachev also understood that he had to improve the economic situation of the ordinary Soviet citizen. Gorbachev's plan was called perestroika, restructuring. He attacked corruption and drunkenness on the job. He allowed an easing of price controls for some goods, and he scaled back central planning and gave state enterprises more autonomy. He permitted the creation of for-profit small cooperatives for providing personal services, legal advice, house cleaning, haircuts, babysitting, delivery, car service, repair and maintenance, etc. But perestroika generally stalled by 1988 amidst economic challenges. Gorbachev's plan for greater freedom of expression went a lot better than his economic planning. Gorbachev's plan was called glasnost, openness. And this plan included not only greater artistic and cultural freedom, but greater transparency from the government also. Gorbachev allowed for more freedom of speech. He allowed denunciations of Stalin in plays and movies. And when the nuclear power plant disaster happened at Chernobyl in 1986, the Soviet government started issuing daily reports to keep people informed. Gorbachev found himself ushering in a cultural revolution. Political democratization. Gorbachev wanted to address the political corruption in the Communist Party. His plan was to force the Communist Party to compete for the support and confidence of the people. In 1989, Gorbachev held the first free parliamentary elections in the Soviet Union since the year 1917. And in April 1989, the Congress of People's Deputies was elected. People were fascinated, following the new Congress's activities on TV for hours. And the Communist Party had to deal with their policy proposals being scrutinized, debated, and even rejected by the new Congress. Democratization inspired numerous ethnic and geographical separatist movements within the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's population had about 146 million Russians and about 140.6 non-Russians. There were 55 million Muslims. There were 44 million Ukrainians. Greater democratization in the Congress of the People's Deputies caused an expansion of independence groups all over the Soviet Union. And separatist movements in the Baltics, Ukraine, and the Caucasus all demanded more autonomy. Foreign affairs. Gorbachev knew that he needed to follow a foreign policy that would reduce East-West tensions if he was to reform the Soviet Union economically. In 1989, Gorbachev finally withdrew Soviet troops from Afghanistan. And in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan agreed to eliminate all land-based nuclear missiles in Europe. Gorbachev rescinded the Brezhnev Doctrine from Lesson 29.1. He pledged to respect the political choices of the various peoples of the East Bloc countries. And this was highly encouraging among reform movements in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. And it began to look as if Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe might be coming to an end.